All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn, and welcome to my guest, Kerry McDonald. Kerry is with us today. She is a senior fellow, a senior education fellow at Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, and also wrote the book Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. That's a 2019 publication, Chicago Review Press. Welcome. How are you today?
Oh, I'm glad to be with you, Deb. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, as I mentioned in the pre-show, I asked you here to talk to my audience about options. I talk a lot on the show about how government school, state school is, in my opinion, antithetical to a free society. So my audience knows I'm an abolitionist. I'm against government school. However, a lot of parents still feel like it's their only option or it's their best option or something along those lines. What would you say to them as an opening?
Yeah, I would say over the past year and a half, I think that illusion has been shattered for many families, beginning with the school shutdowns in the spring of 2020. And all of a sudden, some 50 million U.S. school children displaced from their classrooms and learning alongside their families at home with varying degrees of success. District Zoom schooling was a disaster for many families, and I think it really gave a lot of parents an up-close look at what their kids were learning in these classrooms or what they were not learning. It also separated education from schooling, which is something I talk a lot about in my Unschooled book, but it made that much more clear for parents that they were so accustomed to sending their kids, in most cases, to an assigned district school that it never really occurred to them that there could be other ways that their children might be able to learn. And so throughout the course of the summer of 2020, when it became clear that many schools were going to stay closed for full-time in-person learning, a lot of families started looking more seriously into homeschooling. You saw the rise of the term pandemic pod in July of 2020, and families sort of getting together, pooling resources to hire an educator or some kind of college student or babysitter to oversee a small group of multi-age students in a home or in various homes that the families would get together to create. And of course, that's sort of a modern twist on time-honored homeschool co-ops that have been around since the dawn of the modern homeschooling era. So families started to see, wow, there are these other models. They also began to see that the teachers' unions have quite a bit more power and influence than many parents may have ever thought possible.
Sure.
And the fact that private schools were in many cases able to open safely and successfully for full-time in-person learning in the fall of 2020, while public schools stayed shuttered. And so I think all of that led parents to really question what this kind of assigned district school model is like. They really began to look at other options and realize there's much more available to them. And the data back this up. I mean, we'll probably get more into this, but according to the U.S. Census Bureau data that was released in February, there was a tripling of the U.S. homeschool rate from pre-pandemic levels to over 11% of all U.S. K-12 students being homeschooled, which is over 5.5 million kids.
Right. Now, when many people hear the word homeschool or they hear homeschooling, I think they still have a picture in their mind of mom or dad or mom and dad or something at home around the kitchen table, and mom is the teacher or somebody's a teacher, recreating school at home. And one of the things I've tried to do is explain to my audience that homeschooling isn't really a thing. I almost wish we had a different name because it's more like a customized educational experience for your children. It needn't take place in the home. It needn't be you. So all of these things. How do you talk to people about it who would say that to you? I can't be the teacher, or that feels out of reach to me to homeschool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that unfortunately, the stereotype of homeschooling, like you mentioned, of a parent, typically a mom, sitting around a kitchen table with a bunch of textbooks, delivering a curriculum and replicating school at home. I think that stereotype unfortunately lingers, even though it's far from the reality in the 21st century. And hopefully, families are beginning to realize that over the past year and a half. There are just so many abundant resources available to families to facilitate learning. That this sort of idea that you need to replicate some school in your kitchen, just doesn't hold any longer. Really, homeschooling, I define it as sort of this umbrella term for all kinds of schooling alternatives. So it could include things like these learning pods or pandemic pods or microschools that were gaining a lot of traction prior to the pandemic response and have really taken off since the school shutdowns and over the past year and a half. These microschool networks that operate, again, as sort of multi-age one-room schoolhouse models, typically with a set curriculum or self-directed sort of emergent curriculum, many times proprietary. I think of the Prenda learning model that's out of Arizona, for example, that was highly successful before the pandemic and is now, reaching new heights as they, reach more families. So there's that kind of thing. We think about online learning models. So Zoom school through one's district was subpar for a lot of students and families, but that shouldn't dissuade families from really looking at the tremendous amount of high quality private online learning providers that are out there, many of which are low cost and were designed to be highly effective, high quality online learning platforms with a curriculum that was designed for that, with educators that signed on to work for these companies because they believed in online learning. That's just quite a bit different from the kind of Zoom schooling that we saw the past year.
Right. There are companies that have embraced the medium, and they've learned what and how works, or how it works and what works there, because obviously not everything works. You can't recreate your classroom in the physical classroom online. So what can you do? My own children go to an online academy for their homeschooling experience, and that's what they do. It's a great hybrid of the online learning platform, and then they go offline. They're actually on that for very few hours out of the week. They do most of their work offline, but their mentors, they're called mentors, are accessible to them by email and so forth in a way that is, they're much more responsive than the public school teachers. They just don't need them every minute to hold their hand. Now they're middle school and high school, so it's a little older. But as you mentioned, there's so many options for all the different age ranges that you're not stuck, either being all on or all off. So that's something people can look into. Now, of course, the next question people ask all the time is, what about socialization? And my point has been, look around at the past year. Is that what you, what do you mean by socialization, first of all? And if the government school is trying to socialize your children in ways that conflict with your values, conflict with your principles and so forth, is that really to their benefit or yours? That's sort of my thing. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of that knee-jerk question. Certainly, when I first began was introduced to homeschooling 20 years ago now, when I was doing a research project as an undergraduate and met a homeschooling family, that was my first question. So I'm ashamed to say was, what about socialization? And it became very clear very quickly that what I was really asking, and I think what most people are asking, are your kids social? Are they interacting with other people? And the kind of interactions that homeschoolers get are much more authentic, much more sort of genuine immersion in the people, places, and things around us, multi-age. When we contrast that with the socialization that occurs in government schools, it's age segregated. It's the same static handful of teachers and the same group of kids going to the same building every day, doing the same standardized curriculum. Whereas again, homeschoolers have a much richer broader exposure to all kinds of different interactions with their community members. And some research backs this up. Daniel Hamlin is a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and he's done research on homeschoolers on what he calls cultural capital. And he finds that homeschoolers are far more likely, in fact, twice as likely than school children to have these kind of cultural capital experiences, like going to the library, bookstores, museums, zoos and nature centers, cultural events or community events. They're much more likely to do that than school children because, of course, they have more time, they have more of that family connection and family involvement. And there is, with homeschooling, sort of this zest for learning and discovery that I think really invades the entire family, really eager to experience, new learning opportunities.
Well, and the children are able to do these things with like-minded, sort of a self-selected group of like-minded families or like-minded students, so that you're not going on a field trip where it's like a release from the classroom, And I remember field trips where we would go to the museum and I don't remember looking at anything. It was just an opportunity to not be at school that day.
Right.
And when you go with your homeschool co-op or you with your parents or with some friends of your parent, whatever, you can do all kinds of things in a higher quality, more information rich way than you could do, 50, 100 kids at a time on a bus and so forth. So these activities are similar. You should just do them more often. You choose what they are. You choose when they fall in your curriculum. And you, as you say, you have options. Now, when you speak about microschools, can you explain to the audience what you mean by a microschool structurally, and also the mechanics of setting one up to the extent that how are people doing it?
Yeah. So microschools, learning co-ops, learning pods or pandemic pods are all very, very similar. And what they typically involve are a group of families coming together that either take turns having parents sort of facilitate a curriculum or guide the group at one home, or taking turns in different homes, or again, pooling resources to hire educators. And I wrote back in 2020, in fact, that a lot of traditional educators were finding that they could make more money and have more flexibility being one of these learning pod facilitators or private tutors for various families than they could be as traditional educators. And so they left the school system to do that. And I think you're seeing more and more of that. There are these pod enablers or microschool networks. I mentioned Prenda, that existed pre-pandemic and is having a lot of success now and can be a model for others. There's also Acton Academy that exists in various states around the country that's also having renewed growth. And these are just, individual parents or educators deciding that they want to create a microschool in their home, but have some of that kind of curriculum support and be able to leverage whatever kind of microschool resources that the parent company is offering. So it's, instead of kind of going it yourself, venturing out to create a learning pod, you can tap into these microschool networks that can help. And then there are these pod enablers. I think of a company, for example, called GetSchoolhouse.com that emerged in 2020. They've raised now several $1 million in venture capital funding. And they bring together families in local geographic areas and that want to create a pod and connect them with a certified educator, certified teacher who will facilitate a curriculum. And so there's more and more of these sprouting. I think one of the silver linings that's come out of the pandemic response has been a burst of education entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs really stepping up to create new models of learning that are really beneficial for parents and students.
That's great. Now, if the parents are hearing this and think this is fantastic and there are so many options, now we have the flip side of that coin, which is, what should I look for? How will I choose? And I've had people specifically ask me, should I look for certified educators? In other words, we're leaving the public school, but should I care if the person who's being hired, either by the facilitator or by the group of families, has a certificate in my state or has some kind of credential? Like, what's your take on that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's up to each individual family. And if you use one of these kind of pod connectors, it could be built into the model. But I definitely wouldn't have a certified teacher be the make or break deal. In fact, I think in some cases it could be a liability because certified teachers might have a specific vision of learning that's more like kind of a state compulsory schooling model, and you might want something a little more flexible. So you might look for somebody, for example, who has a background in Montessori education or Waldorf education, or more of a classical model of education. There's a whole host of different kinds of educational philosophies that might fit your family and your children's needs better than kind of a state certified teacher would.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned educational philosophy, because one of the things I've tried to educate parents about on this channel is that that's an important thing to have. If you haven't thought about it, you should probably sit down and think about that and figure that out. What is yours? And there are series of questions. I think you can even find questionnaires out there in the internet somewhere to help you or guide you. But really, what is the project you're working on is how I put it to parents. Like, what kind of person would you like to help your child become in the end? What are your values? What are your principles? What do you want them to be able to do? And what does thriving look like to you? And then when you know what that is, then you really need to find people in your network, if you're building this kind of pod river, who will reflect that. And I'm taking it for granted people are leaving the government schools because there's something about that doesn't fit with their values. Okay. So you have to figure out what does. It don't just, fly in space, and don't be undone by the state standards. In other words, states have certain standards, but that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to run afoul of them, that your student is not going to achieve them, to meet them if you pursue things your way. In fact, I would argue they probably will surpass the state standards by accident, if you do things that way.
And again, you have to look at, I think, homeschooling or any of these schooling alternatives as just one of many options available under private education, right? And private education is typically, most states not held to the same sort of state compulsory schooling standards. You don't have to have the same kinds of curriculums or take the same state certified tests, for example, if you're in a private school in a particular state. So I think you can look at that from the homeschooling perspective or the microschool perspective in the same way, that you have so much more freedom and flexibility to craft, to create, to seek out and find a curriculum and an educational philosophy and approach that works best for your family and your learner.
Right. I think people assume they have to hit certain milestones at certain times because that's what the school is telling them. And I mean, what has been your experience as a homeschooling parent in terms of that, in terms of what you think your kids have had to learn by virtue of teaching versus just experientially they've picked up on and, done a great job without you worrying about what day, what time, what month did they hit this milestone? What would you say?
Yeah, I'll tell you, in the book, I write about how the New York Times pointed out a couple of years ago in an article on the surge in homeschooling even at that time, and the fact that it was more urban secular families sort of leading the trend. The number one motivator for today's homeschooling families, according to federal data, is concern about the environment of other schools. So the New York Times did a good job of kind of highlighting this a few years ago. And one of the main reasons they found for a lot of, in particular, urban secular families who were leading the growth in homeschooling for choosing this educational approach was dissatisfaction with standardized curriculum, particularly Common Core curriculum frameworks that were being introduced in states, and frequent standardized testing, and all of this kind of coming from a beginning and with the No Child Left Behind Act at the turn of the millennium, and really being ramped up over the past couple of decades. And parents saying, no, I don't want my child having the standardized education. I want to encourage their creativity and their curiosity and their human flourishing. And we see really, again, with this focus on standardization, expectations for children, particularly at the younger ages and younger grades, just really much more aggressive than anything we would have experienced when we were in school. and really changed a lot again over the past couple of decades. So the point now being that you have a lot of kindergartners that are expected to read. And if they're not reading by the end of kindergarten, for instance, they are, potentially labeled as reading delayed. And then they have all these interventions when it could just be that they're not developmentally ready to read. And in an earlier time, they would never have been expected to read. But because we have these curriculum frameworks now, because we have standardized testing in elementary school, they have no choice. They have to be reading so that they can keep up with these arbitrary curriculum standards and tests. And that's just one example. I think a lot of families, realizing that this is not working. You see similarly more children being labeled with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, at ever younger ages because they're unable to sit still and listen. Well, again, if you're 4 and 5 years old, you're not meant to do that. And in fact, back in 2018, I wrote about this extensively at fee.org. Harvard researchers came out with a study finding that in states that had a September 1st kindergarten cutoff, meaning you had to be 5 years old by September 1st in that state, that children that turned 5 in August, so were among really the youngest kids in their kindergarten class, were 30% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than the kids who were born in September and were almost 6, right? Because, as parents, we know a year makes an enormous difference in early childhood. And a newly minted 5-year-old can do a lot less in terms of sitting still and listening and following instructions than a child is about to turn 6 years old. But instead of acknowledging that very true fact of early childhood development, they get slapped with an ADHD label, potentially medicated. In many cases in this study, they found it was mostly boys who are naturally exuberant and want to be out running and playing instead of sitting down trying to figure out how to learn to read when they're 4 or 5 years old. So there's just a lot of mismatch, I think, in today's standardized schooling model that's really harmful to children, and parents are realizing this and deciding to opt out.
Right. And it's what I heard just there, and you said children are being diagnosed. Sounds like the school is initiating the process of seeking the diagnosis.
Yeah, in most cases, ADHD diagnoses originate with a teacher.
Yeah, that's a problem. I don't think that teachers should be getting involved in medical diagnoses or even recommending those kinds of things. I can understand a teacher, somebody who spends time with your child, saying, here are some observations I have that are, concerning me, and this is what's going on in class, and maybe you want to talk to your child, or something like that, or here's how it's impacting their learning in the classroom, if that's what you think. But it should probably stop there.
Yeah, there's an interesting statistic that research done by Daphne Bassick at the University of Virginia. She found that in 1998, only about 30% of kindergarten teachers thought that kindergartners should be reading by the end of kindergarten. And by 2010, so just 12 years later, that was 80% of kindergarten teachers thinking that 5-year-olds should be reading. So, a huge shift. But I think a lot of that is really not that the teachers necessarily have changed, but that the environment that the teachers are working in have changed, where they are now caught in this conveyor belt model of schooling where they have to get these kids ready for this standardized curriculum and for these tests. And if the kids aren't passing the test, it reflects poorly on their teaching. So they're caught up in the system just as much as the students are, which is why, in fact, one of the really interesting things about my Unschooled book was that, I traveled around the country to a lot of these self-directed learning centers and homeschool resource centers and other schooling alternatives. And the vast majority of these programs were created by former public school teachers who just became so disillusioned by what they were seeing in the classroom that they also opted out and became entrepreneurial to create new models.
I'm seeing a lot of that, or I'm getting letters privately from teachers who are saying, I left, I retired, I want to retire, I'm on the verge of leaving, these kinds of things. They're also feeling the pressure on, themselves to do certain things in the classroom they don't want to do. Now, the other thing that seems like a paradox to me is the pressure to push the kids towards reading and the standardized tests, while at the same time not even using the science of reading to teach reading. So, in other words, it feels to me like the preferred pedagogy in school for teaching reading is one that is unlikely to work for 99% of 5 and 6 year olds, regardless. Like, I mean, there you are pressuring them to do something, but the method you're using to teach them is just unlikely to work. Even if it were appropriate, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know. I feel like they that to me feels like a disconnect.
Well, I mean, the reading wars have been around for a good half century when we talk about phonics or whole language or all these different reading approaches. But I think what is more likely happening now is that you have these expectations on young children to learn to read at ages where we previously would never have expected young children to be reading. And so regardless of what kind of method you're using, they're just not ready. And then we're again labeling them and potentially, having them sort of carry this label of reading delayed, even though they're 5 years old and they're just not ready. Well, but give them another year and they will be.
That's a great point too, because if we separate the method and we leave, like as you said, the reading wars to the side, what child is going to love reading or be excited to learn to read if all they feel like is there's this thing you have to do and you're not doing it right and you're not doing it fast enough? I think you would hate it. I mean, you would want to avoid doing it, want to avoid learning it. You'd almost shut down. I felt that way with math. I was in a Montessori setting until I was about 8.5 years old, almost 9. And then life circumstances had to be put into public school. And because Montessori allows you to arrive at things as you're ready, a little bit more, I had done less math than I had done reading. I was an avid reader. I was reading way above grade level, but my math was a little bit behind the typical public school grade level. So I was labeled, delayed and behind, and, you need extra help, and you can't do math and all these things. And it stuck. It really stuck all the way till high school. I felt like I was stupid and I just couldn't do math and I would never be good at math. And anytime I looked at a math book or math worksheet, I'd almost freeze up. So I can imagine how a kid feels if they're being pressured with the reading. They're just not going to really want to read. And of course, it's not like they lack for distractions that, would take the place of reading anyway. So,
right. There's a couple of things on that. One is some research I cite in my Unschooled book shows that the natural age for proficient reading in children who are learning outside of a conventional school is about 8.5, meaning that around 8.5, most children will be able to read almost anything. And it's a bell curve, right, where you'll have some precocious readers that learn at 4 or 5, and then you'll have some on the other tail that are closer to 10 or 11, even before they're reading proficiently. Typically, though, those later readers, the readers who will be learning, after 8.5, they will very quickly be reading really advanced material. So even though they're later, they'll quickly catch up to their peers and in fact may surpass them. And one of my favorite stories in my Unschooled book came from a mom whose son grew up unschooled, and he was about 10 or 11 before he learned to read. She said she was never really worried because he was so interested in other things and was so successful in other things that she just felt like that was taking a lot of his attention, but certainly it was in the back of her head. But years later, she really reflected on the fact that she was glad that she didn't push reading on him, didn't kind of have him labeled as reading delayed because he's pre-med or he was pre-med. And she said, I don't think he would have ever taken that academic path if he ever internalized this idea that he was somehow behind or less than or not as good a reader as his peers. So there's a lot we don't really know about kind of the long-term impact that early childhood education could have, in particular with these push down expectations on children.
Well, you're touching on something that I do want to delve into a little bit, which is with these top down and push down expectations, the psychological impact of schooling. And I use the term schooling in the sense that, you go to a building and you go somewhere, and that could be private, it could be public. But I think the amount of structure really needs to, be determined based on the child, not that, this is what school should look like. So there are those children who love that, love structure, and want the kind of regimented structure you might find in a typical, even a Catholic school, for example. There are kids who thrive in that environment. But then there are a lot of kids who really don't. As you pointed out, they do better when they can be more self-directed and dive into their interests, especially if they're at all, neurodivergent, as they say, right? And if they're not typical, then, pushing them into a structure like that could be truly harmful. I mean, they will end up feeling stigmatized or, avoidant when it comes to certain things. So I think getting to know, would you agree with that getting to know your own child and thinking about, how does my kid do in other settings? Did they ever go to any kind of a camp or a daycare, or even spending time with friends? Observe how they act. What other advice would you give to people to figure out the type of setting that would be least most conducive to their thriving and least conducive to that kind of pressurized stigma?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is what you're saying is research and look around and see what's available. But I think it also depends on a vibrant free market in education and really supporting the proliferation of education entrepreneurship, reducing regulation and barriers to entry for these new learning models to sprout. That's one thing I'm somewhat hopeful that maybe came out of the pandemic policy in certain states. For example, I know in Pennsylvania, they were working on a law to protect, or a regulation to protect, learning pods and these sort of homeschool models from government overreach. In other states, you had some deregulation happening early on during the school closures that allowed organizations like the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club to extend their programming to daytime instead of just after school or summertime. You had licensed early childhood care centers, daycare centers that were able to extend their services to older students. So those are the kinds of things that I think would encourage more education entrepreneurship and loosen up some regulations for some real innovation. And I think that's what parents are really clamoring for now. And it does seem like the free market's stepping up.
Yeah, I hope I see that too. And I hope it continues. I keep running across people who ask me, what can I do? I want to offer services, or I want to help. What do you think? I mean, short of just hanging up a shingle and building a website, for example, would you suggest that they try to align with some of these groups like Prendo, or like, the Schoolhouse, Get Schoolhouse or something? Or what?
Yeah, I think it's up to them, right? How ambitious are they? How much do they want to create something new and take the leap as an entrepreneur, versus how much do they just want to work as an educator in an innovative space? And there are opportunities for both. I think that because we have this growing alternative school market, there are real profitable ways for educators to make a living outside of a conventional classroom. I think of Outschool.com, for example, that allows really anybody to come in and teach classes to students, and you get sort of immediate feedback. If your classes are good, they fill up and you can earn a good salary. And if you're not that good, you won't get a lot of repeat customers, or your reviews will be poor and you might have to find something else. So that's a good way to sort of test the waters. But I do think, it really depends. Do you want to be the one out there taking the risk and hanging up the shingle, or do you want to, work with one of these other organizations that's already doing that?
Right. What would you say to people who are still feeling like they should just keep pushing for reform, that they, that they're not happy, but this seems so, it's a little too much. They're not ready to pull away. Shouldn't they just reform the schools, or should they fight back, kind of take back, fight back? These are the phrases I'm hearing. What do you say to those parents?
Yeah, I think there's two schools of thought. There are people who believe that the government school system can be reformed, and there are people like me who think it can't. I think it's working exactly as it was designed. It's a coercive model of learning that was implemented in particular to keep out parents. I mean, that was sort of explicitly its initial inception when the first compulsory schooling statute was passed in my state of Massachusetts in 1852 and then replicated to other states. It was very clear that the intent was to crowd out parents and crowd out choice and a free market of education alternatives, and to have everybody assimilated into this one dominant, at the time, Anglo-Saxon Protestant model of education with a standardized curriculum and standardized teacher training. I mean, that was the explicit goal and design.
How ironic. How ironic.
Yeah. And so I don't think you can reform that. That's how it was designed. I think the way that we improve education is to reduce the power and influence of government on education. My, primary goal would be to eliminate compulsory schooling laws in every state and to move toward a fully privatized education system.
Right. And I'm on the same page, as I mentioned to you before the show. I know many in my audience are not, but that's my goal is to get them there one by one. But I think what people might be struggling with is the why of that. Now, you mentioned just now, you said it's working exactly as designed and to standardize us. But some people will say, yes, but that was then and this is now, and that was a long time ago, and so forth. And what's interesting is, as you pointed out, it was created to crowd out the parents so that it could coercively, standardize the culture. And now I'm hearing people say they would like to see, the people who are really big proponents of public school, well, we can't trust parents to do the right thing. We can't, what about the kids who are abused? What about the kids whose parents will do that? Like as if they're all living in, torture chambers when they go home. And it's still there. It's still very much there. This notion that parents bad, school good. And so I keep trying to encourage people, like, listen to what they're saying to you about you. I mean, it's easy to say, well, they're not talking about me. They're talking about these other people I don't know. But I think they are talking about us, like each and every one of us. And I don't know. I just think maybe people are still having trouble seeing how it's hurting their kids to be in this kind of compulsory setting. So is there anything else? I mean, you've said so much already but is there anything else that maybe we didn't touch on that you could think of to add to that?
Yeah, well, I'd say back to kind of your first point of, they'll say, well, that was then, this is now. I'd say, well, yes, but it's actually gotten worse. I mean, the first compulsory schooling law, again, in Massachusetts, required compulsory learning for kids ages 8 to 14 for 12 weeks a year, of which 6 needed to be consecutive. Now,
and the parents fought it.
Yes, and that's right. And the parents fought it, and and it was, and immigrant families in particular fought it, and which is why you saw the emergence of Catholic schools in the mid to late 19th century in the US, because these Catholic immigrant families said, we're not sending our children to these purportedly secular but overtly Anglo-Saxon Protestant schools with Protestant teachers and texts that went against their, family morals and values. So, parents have fought back, but I will say that even now, again, particularly over the last couple of decades, schooling has consumed so much of childhood and adolescence that it starts at ever younger ages. There are these after-school programs that now, again, consume most of a child's day. And now, even for teenagers, we see Bureau of Labor Statistics data showing that teen job participation is at an all-time low because they're spending so much of their time in these, sort of academic or extracurricular focused activities, because that's what parents and teachers and the overall culture is saying is so valuable. And they're in fact not getting what's really valuable, which is that sort of hands-on learning experience in their community as a pathway to adulthood.
Which is a form of socialization in itself. If
absolutely.
The point of I think you're right. When people ask that question, they're asking more, are your children social? Do they have social skills, or are they weird? I think that when I hear that question now, I think they're just saying, how will your children not be weird? And they don't really understand that, that children are as social as they want to be, whether they're homeschooled or not. I went to school and I wasn't a very social person. So it's, part of it is your personality. And then if you're home and you're outgoing and you join a co-op and you go places, you'll socialize. So,
Right.
but I think that's an important component of maturing and growing up and being socialized, if you will, to the real world is as you get older, you take on more real world responsibility. You get a job or you're out in the community. There used to be paper routes. Remember paper routes and dog walking and lawn mowing and all the things that we used to do when we wanted an after school job. And now, as you said, it's all taken up.
Right.
And now they want compulsory universal preschool as well.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's just extending its clutches from cradle to grave in terms of government programs and government handouts. And I don't think it's helping families at all. I think it's actually harming them. But to the larger point, what would families do if they don't have access to government schools? Well, even, pre-compulsory schooling laws, there was a wide variety of education options available to families. And there's no doubt that that would exist without government schooling as well. I mean, for example, I always like to use the example of, eating is an essential
Right.
human act, yet we don't have government assigned grocery stores dictated by our zip code. We have a lot of choice and preferences, but but we also have, food stamps for those who really need it. And we're not telling them which grocery store they have to use those food stamps in. We're allowing them the choice. And that's a lot of where I think school choice policy is the interim measure on the way to kind of a fully privatized education system, which would be the libertarian ideal. And that is to say, let's sort of take this more than $700 billion a year in US taxpayer money that's spent on K-12 education and give it back to taxpayers and allow them to make choices about where they spend that money through education savings accounts, tax credit scholarship programs, overall tax credit or tax deduction programs, vouchers, and so on, that it allows the parents to have more control of those tax dollars, those education dollars, rather than bureaucratic school systems.
Right. Does it concern you, though, if they go the voucher route, that the government will still exert control then, or even more control than they currently have over the private models and those other entrepreneurial enterprises? Because in order to get your voucher, you'll have to go to something accredited by the government or what they, so, I mean, that concerns me a little bit.
It's certainly a worry. It's something to think about. You look at states like, for example, I think it was Louisiana that had a voucher program. A lot of schools just decided not to participate in that program. So as long as it's, an opt-in program, some schools will decide to be connected to a state program and receive state funding and possibly have to have some oversight as a result of that, although we can push back on that as well, because again, go back to the food stamp program, that doesn't come with a lot of stipulations.
You must eat your vegetables. They don't do that.
Right. There's I think a handful of things you can't buy with food stamps, but for the most part, you're free to put in your grocery basket whatever you'd like. And so there, again, why can't the same thing be true for education?
Right, exactly. I would like to see the money follow the kids in that way. And I think the thing I've been trying to say, and you're much closer to it than I am through Fee, is I'm just guessing. This is my gut read. I'm not an economist, or don't have daily experience with this, but my feeling is the only way to truly fight back, if you will, is to walk away, is to choose another option, and that the power that we have as parents is in not participating.
Absolutely.
And if we try to do anything while our children are still enrolled, we've given away all of because our power rests with our child. In their presence there. They're sort of a funding mechanism, even though pulling them out doesn't remove all the funding that goes with them. If it happens hundreds of thousands of times, it depletes that. And the union then has less power. So if you're talking even about union power, I don't see another way. In other words, I personally can't see how you take away union power over politicians and all of this other corruption. I don't see how you touch it. Right. I feel like it's almost the armor is so thick that it's the only way. Yeah. Try is like spitballing against armor.
Absolutely. The power of exit is really what will transform education, and it's what already has, partly based on what you're saying, is that if enrollment goes down in a local district school, taxpayers won't want to fund that fully anymore or to the same level. They'll say, first of all, why are you doing tax hikes for fewer students? And second, why are we spending more money at all for these programs when we see that people are leaving, that this is not a high quality program. Right. So I do think the power of exit is critical. I think we've seen that a lot over the past 18 months of families deciding that they don't want anything to do with these, in large part, shuttered district schools that were getting full funding, even though they weren't fully opened. I mentioned earlier that we had this tripling of the independent homeschool rate, according to U.S. Census Bureau data, over the past academic year. Right. Interesting, from the census data, they discovered that the biggest driver of that growth was Black homeschoolers. So that Black homeschoolers had a 5-fold increase from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. And now Black homeschoolers are overrepresented in the overall U.S. homeschool population compared to their representation in the K-12 public school population. And so I think that's interesting, too, that you see families of all demographics deciding to leave this failed government school system.
Right. And for a wide variety of reasons, too. It's not just like one reason. We have people who've left because they're concerned about safety, for whether it's social safety because of bullying, whether it's safety because of COVID, they don't trust that things will be safe, or they just don't want their kids wearing masks, or, there's so many reasons. It's hard to pinpoint any one, but it all adds up, in my opinion, to believing there's a better way that they can actually do it. So the cost of exiting is going down. Absolutely. Relative to the cost of staying, which is how the free market works. And so, right. I mean, I'm very hopeful. Are you hopeful, or do you feel like?
I am hopeful. If you'd asked me a month or two ago, I would have said that I would have still been hopeful, but I would have said that a lot of that growth in the homeschooling population that occurred last year would dry up or would decline as schools reopen for full-time in-person learning this year. Now I'm not so sure there will be any kind of decline or dip, because I think parents are seeing that even though schools reopen, their kids may have to wear masks all day. There's still going to be frequent virus testing, continued social distancing following CDC guidelines. CNN, for example, just reported on Friday about a public charter school in Atlanta that opened last Tuesday. And by Friday, more than 100 kids were in quarantine for possible exposure to COVID because a couple of kids and a staff person tested positive. And so now they're out. And I just think for parents, they're going to look at this and say, gosh, why would I put my kids through another disruptive academic year, right, with so much uncertainty and unpredictability and all of these, virus mitigation measures that are impacting their social development? I'm going to opt out. I'm going to find another alternative. And thankfully, there's more alternatives now for them.
Well, and why would they put themselves through it? I mean, that's their life too. If you're trying to organize your life as an adult around where your children are all day, and then suddenly it's, you're out for 14 days. I mean, now you've got to, so one of the suggestions I've been making to people is to spend what's left of the summer, if they haven't gone back yet, or I advised this earlier, and make a plan, because the likelihood is pretty high that they'll be shut down again, they'll be closed down again. So think about that, factor that into your decision-making process. It's not, we're opening on this day and you can expect smooth sailing, because they've shown that's not the case. But I did want to get to this one question. Your pal says, you don't think government would just pass a law forcing parents to send their kids to the school first? So in other words, if enough of us pull away and we start to reach critical mass in, around the country, it's already, you see it increasing steadily. Do you think this is in the offing? Do you think this is likely that they'll try to outlaw homeschooling?
So if we go back historically, back to those Catholic families that refused to comply with those initial compulsory schooling statutes and instead created their whole parallel system of parochial schools, a lot of states didn't like that. And in 1922, the state of Oregon outlawed all private schools. Fortunately, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the landmark decision of Pierce versus Society of Sisters that upheld the right of parents to send their children to private schools and Justice McReynolds, who wrote the opinion of the court, said, the child is not the mere creature of the state. So as long as we have a U.S. Supreme Court precedent upholding private education, then I'm not fearful of that.
Well, thank you for that, because I hope that gives a lot of people some comfort, because that has come up before, this idea that, oh, they're just going to outlaw homeschooling. And while it gets talked about every year at Harvard, every year they bring it up and they have their little conference and they say, how are we going to, get rid of homeschooling? Which is one of the reasons I keep trying to encourage people to call it private schooling or independent schooling or something else other than homeschooling, not because I think it's going to change whether it will or won't be, attacked, but because it does change it in the mindset. It changes the cultural understanding and appreciation for what it is. It is private schooling. It's just on a much smaller scale. And
I think you're right. We do have to push back against that. I was able to debate live Professor Elizabeth Bartlett, the Harvard Law School professor who called for a presumptive ban on homeschooling last year. And the Cato Institute, where I'm an adjunct scholar, hosted a live debate with her, and I was able to go toe to toe. So you can find that on the Cato Institute website if you're interested. But I think we were able to challenge a lot of her outdated stereotypes and a lot of incorrect data she had about homeschooling experiences and outcomes. And I think we have to continue to do that. So certainly want to be vocal supporters for homeschooling rights and for educational freedom more broadly, while exiting from these government schools.
Now, you mentioned a few times today already data. What stands out to you in the data that you think my audience should know about in terms of government schooling? What do you want people to understand about the data?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. spends so much money on K-12 learning, and yet has, really middling or mediocre, in some cases, failing results, particularly for low-income and minority students. The proficiency levels coming out of government schooling are horrifically low, and yet we see a lot of success coming from education choice programs and certainly from private education. And so the more that we can reduce the size and scope of government schooling and expand the free market of education, I think they'll be better serving families and students for the long run.
Right. I mean, I'm very concerned about the illiteracy rate. I mean, it's just way too high for a society such as ours, in my opinion. And a lot of people think of illiteracy and they think that people can't read at all. They just like pick something up and they can't read it. And I think that is true in many cases, but I'm also concerned about even reading proficiency, that people may read, but it's at a superficial level. They don't have a broad vocabulary. They're not able to think critically about important issues of our time. And that can make people easier to manipulate, which of course perpetuates everything that we're trying to protect our kids from. So, and ourselves. All right. That is great. I'm trying to find I want to find the link so I can share it with people to the debate. And you say it's on the Cato website?
Yeah, if you go to my page on the Cato website, you just put in my name, Kerry McDonald, and Cato Institute, you'll come up with my personal page at Cato. And I think it's on there and under conferences or events or something, there's a special link. And then you can find all of my work. My primary work is with FEE.org, the Foundation for Economic Education, which is the country's oldest libertarian think tank, founded in 1946. And there you can see links to all of my articles, a link to my book, and actually see my new, brand new free ebook, the 2021 Curious Parents Guide to Education Options, which really, I think, gets into more detail about some of the top topics we've discussed today around, what really is available to parents. It goes beyond homeschooling. There are other really affordable and accessible options that families have, especially now, that can help them to opt out of their district school.
Right. I'm getting your page. I'm going to put this up, guys. I'm going to put it in the comments here. So this is Kerry's page at Cato, and I'm also going to put this up in a banner so you can see where to go. And all right, that's where you want to go. And I did find, and I put in the comments, the link to the debate. I think that's really important to see that they're doing what they're doing. Because I get emails about this. Deb, they're saying this stuff at Harvard, and yes, it's okay. There's somebody fighting back. So
there's a lot of us fighting back. I mean,
yeah,
that's one thing, as you know, right? Whenever you cross homeschoolers, we won't let that stand.
No, we're a pretty passionate bunch. So, all right. So, anything in closing that you would like people to know other than where to go to find you, please do follow Kerry. You can follow her also on Twitter. That's one of the places I follow. And make sure you check out Cato and also Fee, read the articles there and get the ebook. I looked at it today and I remember I forgot to bring it up here, but that is an invaluable resource. And thank you so much for making it available free to everybody.
Yeah, all of Fee's content is free and available on a Creative Commons license. So please, again, go to fee.org/Kerry. You can see links to all of my social media accounts and my email there. My Twitter is Kerry_edu. So look forward to connecting.
Okay, great. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. This has been very, very helpful. I think I managed to cover most of the questions I've gotten asked most often. Anybody else who's there listening have anything in a final closing question that you are just burning to ask Kerry today? I'll put it out to you. Otherwise, we will let her go on with her day. If you do have other questions, I think you can certainly email, as I did, or post them on social media, right? That they could, send you a note.
Yeah, that's right. And I also have at Fee, if you go to that fee.org/Kerry link that's on the website now or the screen now, you can sign up for my weekly free email newsletter through Fee, where I talk about current events and kind of share the week's news in terms of education from a libertarian or free market perspective. So that's another way of connecting.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been invaluable. And I'm hoping that people will take this and share this. If you know a parent out there who is asking these questions, just say, oh, here, listen to this conversation. And they can contact Kerry and ask any further questions. So thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to everybody else for listening. And I will see you next time.
Thanks, Deb.